Hello and welcome to This Week in Travel. I'm your host Michelle Robson and I'm also editor of Turning Left for Less. As you can see if you're watching on YouTube, I am not at home again this week. I am still in South Carolina. I'm actually in Hilton Head. I'm staying at the Westin here and it's Hilton Head Beach you can see in the background. I'll talk a little bit about where I've been on my travels. If you want to hear more about Charleston, then have a listen into last week's where I talked a bit about Charleston. I drove from Charleston to Savannah, which is around a 2-hour drive and very easy. If you haven't driven in the US, it's very simple. The roads are wide, parking spaces are wide. It's just geared for driving, much easier than the UK, I'd say. Though I did have a bad experience with Avis, so I would definitely recommend if you want to get a car from Charleston, do not hire with Avis because there was an hour-long queue just to even get the contract, and the Avis Preferred did not work well. So moving on from that, Savannah is very similar to Charleston in terms of the feel of it. There's lots of old buildings with the beautiful gas lamps, the wooden fronts, very historic, a lot of preserved buildings, which is great. Slightly different style in that you see more wrought iron, which is a bit more like New Orleans, but it's still very similar to the Charleston style. It's a bigger area. It's definitely more lively because it's a university town and a little bit more touristy. There was a bit more of the tourist hat shops and restaurants that were very touristy, but there's also some really nice places to eat and plenty of speakeasies, and there's quite a lot of speakeasy culture. There's a museum about it. You can do cocktail making classes, and it's definitely a bit more lively, I'd say, than Charleston, but I'd also say a little bit less upmarket, but definitely worth a visit. There were lots of squares, which you don't get so much in Charleston. It felt very green and leafy. They have these beautiful old trees with these sort of hanging, it's like a sort of parasitic plant, but it makes it look great. These beautiful old trees and squares with plants and flowers surrounded by beautiful old houses. So yeah, it's a very pretty, charming place. So definitely worth it if you're going to do a driving holiday in the area. Hilton Head's around about an hour away. All along the coast here there's lots of different resorts. Hilton Head is probably one of the most well known, and most of the chains of hotels are represented here. So there's Marriott and Hilton hotels all along the coast here. There's a couple of Marriott vacation clubs as well as a Marriott normal hotel and the Westin as well. The Westin is going through some renovations at the moment. You might actually hear some noise in the background possibly. And the new rooms look great, but the old ones are definitely quite dated. I'm not sure if I would necessarily stay at this hotel again. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is quite isolated. Trying to get out at night if you don't want to drive is tricky. It's generally sort of 15-minute wait for an Uber if you can get one at all, which I found a bit of a pain. Some of the others are better situated. You are next door to a Marriott here, so you could pop next door, but it's a Marriott vacation club, so I don't think they really have much of a restaurant there. There are some great restaurants nearby, lots of seafood as you'd kind of expect, but really you have to drive or just be prepared to have a long wait. My worry is kind of getting stranded somewhere since there only appear to be about 2 Ubers on the island and I'm not sure what time they went to bed. So just bear that in mind and choose somewhere perhaps where there's a few things nearby if you want to go out in the evening. So if you go back to Charleston from here, the nearest airport probably that you'd want to fly into the UK, then it's about 2 hours drive again. There are, as I said before, no direct flights to the UK from Charleston, but you can connect through a number of places. My ticket was with British Airways and I am connecting through Philadelphia. In the news this week, there's some better news from British Airways. If you travel in economy on British Airways, although you get a free bottle of water and a packet of crisps or some sort of flapjack, you can't order like you used to do on board. Prior to COVID, I'm sure we all remember that you had a full menu that you could order on board, including sandwiches and pies and things like that. But it all went out of the window and it just meant that you had to order in advance. Which obviously a lot of people don't necessarily know if they want something to eat and they might not want to be thinking about ordering in advance. So it was a bit of a pain really. The good news is that British Airways have now announced that at Gatwick it's definitely coming back in May with some new items to celebrate the coronation, and there will also be some new club meals. I've heard some reasonably good feedback about the club food from Gatwick, and in compared with Heathrow, they actually seem to be more on time as well. So perhaps Gatwick is a better option at the moment. They also said in the same press release that they would be returning gradually to Heathrow, the same situation where you can order all the regular food on board, like sandwiches and pies. They'll be starting with the longer short-haul flights first, and it will take a few months for them all to get it back on board. But if, like me, you're looking at economy because the prices of club class are so expensive at the moment to Europe, then actually that's good news in that you know that you can get a snack if you haven't pre-planned. So I was pleased to see that. On the other hand, they've also announced that they're going to put up the prices of buying Avios. Now, I would recommend not rushing out to go and buy any. It happens at the end of this month. However, obviously, I would hope that most people only ever buy them when they're going to do an offer, because as we know, they regularly do 50% extra. So I would definitely not buy them now. I would wait for an offer because it will still work out cheaper than buying them at the full price. I'll be publishing an article with all the prices in today, so I will put that in the links below so you can see the full details. And finally, Heathrow have announced that they have made a loss, which I find quite surprising given that passenger numbers are not far off what they were before COVID, and given that they've put up the passenger fees, I'm kind of not understanding why they're not making a profit. I mean, it could be to do with retail potentially, because now there is no tax-free shopping. I'm not sure whether they perhaps have less shops, and I know some didn't reopen after COVID, so that possibly could be it. But interestingly, they're blaming the CAA, because the Civil Aviation Authority get to dictate to Heathrow how much they're allowed to charge for the passenger fee. And the reason for this is obviously they have a monopoly, particularly with British Airways. So they set a fee maximum of what they can charge. And so Heathrow are saying, because they're not allowed to charge as much as they would like, that it's the CAA's fault. Not entirely sure that's true, because if they're allowed to charge whatever they liked, it would just become ridiculous. So I think perhaps they need to look at how they're actually using the money that they're getting. So for this week's main topic, I'm going to talk about how to get cheaper business class flights. There's a few basic principles to this, and also there's some ways to search. Now, obviously, the first thing I'm going to say is subscribe to Turning Left for Less. The reason for this is that we publish fares as they come up, and we also do a regular roundup about every 2 weeks of what the cheapest fares are. And the reason I say this is, yes, you can look for yourself, but it is quite time consuming. It can take quite a few hours, and also if you don't really know what you're doing, then obviously you might get into a bit of a mess with it. Sometimes you can find fares and they don't really exist, etc. So you can waste a lot of time. However, once you've seen the deals that we've published, then there are ways to kind of finesse that and find the dates that you want. So what I'm going to say will also apply even if you've actually subscribed to Turn Left for Less and found details of a flight that sounds like something you want to investigate further. So the first tip that I would have is how you actually search for the flights. If you're looking at British Airways, one of the easiest ways is actually not to use Google Flights, which I'll talk about later, but to use their low fare finder. Now, I'll link this below. What it does is it has a list of places around the world that, starting from London, you can look at pretty much every destination they fly to, and you put in which class that you're looking for and put in how long you want to stay for. So for example, 7 days. And then it shows you all the cheapest fares for every destination. There's different tabs for Europe, North America, etc. Once you've done that, you click on the destination and it will show you every month and what the lowest fares are in a chart. So then you can pick the lowest month if you want, or if you actually have a set of dates in mind, if you click on the month, it will show you which dates the lowest fares are on. So that's really the simplest way to find the cheapest British Airways flight from the UK. Now, if you're looking at flying ex-EU, then it will be different, because you'll need to use Google Flights. So before we go on to that, let's talk about ex-EU and what that means. Basically, it means starting your flight from outside the UK. And I would also include Jersey in this, because sometimes Jersey can be a bit cheaper because they don't have the APD that we do. Doesn't always apply, but definitely worth looking. And plus, sometimes if it's about the same, but you're looking for your tier points, then actually it gives you an extra 40 tier points to fly back to Heathrow to get onto the long haul flight. So that's always worth considering as well. So when we talk about ex-EU, there are certain cities to start from that generally give the lowest fares depending on where you're flying. So if you're flying to the US, generally I would recommend Dublin as your starting point, and also sometimes Paris and Budapest can have good fares. Obviously we search all of them, but those are the ones that I concentrate on if you want to do it yourself. Interesting, for the Maldives, funnily enough, the cheapest one always seems to be Rome. Amsterdam and Paris consistently give good fares as well, generally going east, but sometimes also to America. It's also worth looking at Oslo if you're flying to the Middle East. You can usually get Qatar flights to Dubai or Abu Dhabi from around £1,200 from there. Obviously, you have to factor in the cost of actually getting to these places. So before you book anything, I always look at how much the fares are, because nowadays fares with British Airways can be like £400 returning club as a minimum to a lot of places. So definitely worth factoring that in. And finally, I'd also give a mention for Sofia. Now, this is usually one of the cheapest destinations to fly to with British Airways in business class. It normally costs around £250, which is quite reasonable. And they quite often have some good fares, particularly on Qatar going to Asia. So definitely worth, if you don't mind going to Sofia to start your flight, looking at that. And the good thing about Sofia is it's one of the short haul plus destinations. So you would get 160 tier points returned on your positioning flights. A couple of tips with ex-EU flights. In terms of positioning flights, currently British Airways have a terrible record with around 51% punctuality. So that kind of tells you how much time you need to build in. If you can, I always recommend trying to do a night stop beforehand. Obviously that does build in extra cost. However, I view it as part of the holiday, and I will normally try and allow enough time to do a little bit of sightseeing somewhere. So it's worth considering that. Or you could just stay at the airport and get one of the later flights in. There are also a lot of cancellations, particularly with strikes at the moment. So again, I try not to take the last flight out. One thing you can consider if you want to risk it, but would actually rather take an earlier flight but they're too expensive, is when you book British Airways Club Europe, you're allowed to change your flight on the day. Basically, any time after midnight on the day of travel, in most situations, you can look to change your flight, providing it's not a connecting flight. So you can always book the cheapest flight and then look to change it. You've just got to be prepared to stick with the original flight if there's nothing available. So you're going to want to start by going to Google Flights, which just type in Google Flights and it will come up with this page. Then you are going to want to check what currency you want it in. I've got it in pounds, but if you go to the bottom of the page, you can also get it in any currency that you wish down here. And then we're going to start searching for some flights. Now, the first thing you can do that many people don't know about is you can add more than one starting point. So if you see here, I've put in London, you can narrow that down to different airports if you wanted. For example, if you know the flight definitely goes from Heathrow, so you're looking for British Airways, then I would put in Heathrow because then it narrows it down. Otherwise, you'll get EasyJet and every single flight from every London airport. So you can do that. So let's put in Heathrow. And then if you notice when you click on it, there's actually a plus button, which allows you to select multiple airports. So I'm actually going to leave this blank for now, but you can add in, for example, Oslo. You can add up to 5 different airports. So that's really good if you're quite flexible and you just want to get the cheapest price. So if we take that off and just leave it as London, and then you can do anywhere, which will obviously show you the entire world. I'm actually going to narrow it down a bit, but in fact, if you put in Asia, you can actually use either a continent or you can put in a specific country if you want, or if you want to be really specific, you can put in the airport. But generally, I like to put in something quite broad if I'm flexible on where I'm going. For example, in the US, sometimes there can be 2 airports only an hour's drive apart, and actually there can be £1,000 difference between them. So I like to have a look at everything. So if you put in a continent, for example, Asia, and then just put in, leave the dates as they are if you don't have specific dates, or if you do, you can put in your specific dates, then click on Explore. Now you see now we have a lovely map with all the prices to everywhere in the world, and it's showing those for just the dates that we have selected. Even though I put in Asia, if you actually scroll across, you can see it will show the entire map. So the next thing you might want to do, if you wanted to make a more general search, click on the date bar and then you can click on flexible dates, and then that gives you a choice of either having every single flight in the next 6 months, so it'll show you the cheapest time to fly, or if you specifically want to go in a particular month, you can select that, and then say we pick June, you can either have a weekend, you can either have 1 week or 2 weeks. So we'll leave it as 1 week in June, and then click that and it will show you all the options. Now you can also refine this further with all the filters, which you can see on the left here. So for example, airlines, you'll notice when you're in this broader view, there's only a choice of the 3 alliances. Once you narrow it down to a specific destination, then you can actually put a particular airline in, which is really useful. So let's go for One World. So that will now only show One World prices, and you can also do stops. So for example, if you wanted a direct flight, then you would want to put non-stop only. This normally means if you put non-stop only, it's probably going to be more expensive. So I tend to leave it as it is. You can have things like if you want bags included, duration, if you wanted a particular length of flight, so you didn't want it to be too long, for example, if you're going to Australia. And you can also put in a budget for price. But I normally don't bother. I tend to just keep it quite general so I can see lots of different options. So let's select an option here. Let's go for Dubai. Now once we select the option, then it will come up with all the One World options that are available, because I previously selected One World. And then if we go in further, then it will start to show the cheapest date that you can fly on for that price that it was showing, and all the flights that are One World and non-stop. If we take off non-stop, it should show us a few more options. So there we go, it's got Qatar as well. It actually turns out to be significantly cheaper than British Airways, which is interesting. And actually the cheapest is Royal Jordanian. You can, if you look at the top, you can sort by various different things as well. And if we look at where it says One World, you see now it gives you an option of just having one particular airline. So say I wanted to have only Qatar, I could go down and deselect that, and we'll just put Qatar Airways only, and then it will just show Qatar Airways only. Oh, that didn't take. There we go, Qatar Airways only. And you can see that's narrowed it down. If I'm looking for something in particular, for example, I wanted an early morning flight to make a connection, then you can use times. I find that quite useful for sorting. So if you wanted to leave at any particular time, or you need to arrive by a certain time, you can narrow it down as well. Also, if you're looking for a fare, perhaps to get some tier points, you can put in connecting airports, which is quite useful if you say wanted to go through JFK, and if you were flying to the west coast of the US and wanted to build in a transcontinental for some extra tier points. So you can add that in there if you wanted. So that's the main part of Google Flights. A couple of other little things on this screen that I'll talk about quickly. Firstly, you'll notice this track prices. This is really useful if you've looked at flights and you think it's currently too expensive and you've got a bit of a way to go, then it's definitely worth clicking on that, and it will send you emails telling you when the prices change. So I use that quite a lot, and the price changes can be quite dramatic. Also, perhaps if you don't want to miss a sale, that's a good one, because obviously if prices go down, you should get a notification. It's also another way to look if you wanted to go down a bit more into the detail, perhaps by changing how many days you stay for. You can use the grid, which shows you if you leave on one day and come back on another, what the price would be. That's quite useful, though I don't particularly like the overview. It's a bit complex. Or I quite like the price graph, where you can easily see the cheapest days, and also you can play about with how many days you want to do. So that's useful as well. So that's the overview of Google Flights. We're next going to take a quick look at what is the engine, as it were, behind Google Flights, which is called ITA Matrix. So if you Google ITA Matrix, then you will come up with this page, and this is actually the engine behind Google Flights. Now you may wonder why you want to use this. It's more to get down in the detail of things. It's quite a complex engine, so I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but I will add some links below that give you a bit more detail on how to use it. But I'll just show you a couple of quick tricks. So it's exactly the same as doing a search on Google Flights. You can type in the airport normally, or you can put in the codes, it doesn't matter. However, there are some interesting controls here. If you look at where it says routing codes, it will explain all the different things that you can do. So for example, you could put in a particular carrier, you could put in a direct flight only by a particular airline, and you can also put in what connection point you want as well. So that's routing codes, and there's also extension codes. Now with this, it's a bit more complicated, where you can put in things like the alliance, so One World. You can put in that you don't want to fly on a particular airline, or only want to fly on a particular airline. You don't want overnight flights, all sorts of things that you can change here. generally I don't tend to use that apart from Alliance. If you look here in the it says syntax, and then it's got an example of how you would actually do it. So for example, for One World, you type in Alliance in capital letters, space, and then One World. So that gives you an idea of how to use that. So we're going to try this, where you've got two options. You see an exact date or a calendar of lowest fares, and then there can only be 7 days between them. So you could do 1 to 8 nights, or as I've done, 3 to 10 nights. And that will bring up a calendar that you can have a look at of when the lowest fares are. So that's quite useful. And then down here you can put in your business class. If you wanted, you could put in the currency. So for example, I would, if I was doing something that was from XEU, I would normally put in GBP for British pounds, so that I can see the price in pounds rather than euros, so it gives me a bit more of an idea. So if we do search, you will notice it takes longer than doing it on Google Flights, because it's bringing up some more complex information. So the reason I've been doing that search is because of the really good offer that I wrote about for JetBlue business class, which, as you can see, is, well, I'm assuming that's the JetBlue one. It's about £1,250. So we can see very easily from this calendar exactly what flights are the cheapest and on what dates. So I think in some ways it's slightly clearer than the Google one. And if you click on a particular date you want to leave, it will show you all the options and what the cheapest is for the number of nights. So I'm going to select 6 nights, since that's the cheapest. And then it will come up with this really quite handy bar. So you can see, yep, the JetBlue flight is still available, which I think is a great price for £1,248. And it will then show you all the different options. So if you decided you want to fly JetBlue, you click on that, and then you can see it will show you all the different prices and exactly what the flight times are, etc. So I do find it slightly easier to use than Google Flights. So the next thing that I think is quite useful here is if you click on it, it will give you more details with aircraft type, etc. And then it will give you this rather complicated looking set of numbers here. Now the bit that's useful here is where it says rules. So if you click on this, then you can see it takes you into all the different rules. So if you're looking for something in particular and you can't work out why the price is more on a certain day, etc., it will show you that you can only go outbound Tuesday to Thursday and only come back Monday to Wednesday. So that's quite useful if you're trying to build a fare and you just want to see what the restrictions are. Also, if you're hesitating a bit and you're not sure whether the fare's about to run out, it will normally show you if it's only available for a specific number of days. Now, I would take that with a pinch of salt, because some of them sometimes will say it's valid for like the next 6 months and then withdraw it anyway, but it at least gives you an idea. Normally, if the date's like within the next week or two, that's normally going to stick. However, if it's sort of no end to it, or it's a date 6 months in advance, I wouldn't hesitate too much, because it could change again. And it also gives you all the other rules about, so for example, this one's it has to be at least 120 days before. That's why it wouldn't be available currently, and how long you have to stay, the minimum stay requirements, and also stopovers is quite useful for something like a British Airways to the US. And see whether you could stop over in New York, for example. You can always stop over with pretty much all fares for a maximum of 24 hours. It will also show transfers, and a transfer is basically where you change flights, so it can be good for getting extra tier points, so breaking up your flight, say via New York, as I mentioned earlier. And then there we go, valid for travel commencing on or after 2nd of April, so you know that's when it started from. And then there's usually a lot of very boring stuff, and then the bit that you might want to look at is the penalties. So you can see the ticket's non-refundable, goes through all the rules about that. And it also talks about changes and cancellations. So it's a really clear way to see whether you can actually change the fare once you've bought it. So that's the real basic overview of using ITA Matrix. I will just go back and show you one other thing that I find quite useful. And you can see here, when we show the results, you can either do complete trips, individual flights, so that will just show the specific flights, or the thing I quite like is the time bar. Now with this, I'm going to choose one that's got a stop in it, because that's what I tend to use it for. So you can see it shows you a very clear time bar of exactly how long the connections are in a sort of pictorial way, and I find this quite easy way to pick out which flights they want to take, because obviously it shows you the connections very quickly, and it will show you a whole page of these if it's something with lots of different options, and it obviously shows you where you connect as well. So when you're looking for something a bit more complex, I find that really useful. So it's definitely worth bearing in mind the time bar option rather than just complete trips. I'll just finish by mentioning one thing that I didn't say on Google Flights before, so we're just going to go back to that. When you select a flight, you may be wondering whether it's going to be Club World, the old one, or the new one. Now obviously if you go in and book and do a dummy booking, you can see when you get that far, but Google Flights does have a very useful feature. You can see here it says lie flat seat, and we'll just check the other ones. Lie flat seat, individual suite. So if you see individual suite, that means at the moment it's currently going to be a club suite. Now I would take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because obviously things change, but at least allows you to select that flight to start off with if you wanted the club suite, and then you can go into the British Airways when you make the booking and then double check it. But it's a really quick way to just check something. You don't, for example, if you just wanted to check what a particular flight was operating rather than going into British Airways, it's a lot quicker to just do a very quick search on Google Flights. So I find that really handy. So that's kind of the ways that I would search for cheap flights. You could also use Skyscanner, but I'm just going to show you a quick example of that. And there's obviously one called Kayak as well, but I tend to use Skyscanner more out of the two. And this one is showing Charleston because that's where I currently am. We did London too. It does something similar with these different searches. And I should mention you can do multi-city search on Google Flights and on ITA Matrix as well. But let's just do something simple like JFK. Now you'll notice here that it shows this calendar. Unfortunately, it's not so good for showing it when you're trying to do a business class flight. If you do add date there, you can see it actually shows you which are the most expensive dates, which is quite useful. So let's just pick some random dates and do search. And it's currently showing it in dollars because I'm in the US. And then it will show you best, which is actually what they would view as the shortest flight with the least connections that's cheapest, but you can put in cheapest flight, or you can use fastest. As you can see, there's various different options there. Now if we pick something, for example, like Turkish Airlines has a very interesting route to Istanbul and then back again to JFK. This would be the reason why I don't like using Skyscanner most of the time. If you look at here at who you can book that flight with, I've pretty much only heard of 2 of those. And GoToGate does not have a good reputation. Flight Network, I don't know a huge amount. I've heard about them, but as you can see, all of these are not with the actual airline. They're with online agencies, and I would definitely be wary of using a lot of these. I would certainly be looking at Trustpilot before I put my money anywhere near any of these, and I would definitely pay with a credit card so that if something goes wrong, you've got some comeback. I mean, generally a lot of the agencies are absolutely fine unless something goes wrong. When something goes wrong, then you begin to wish you'd booked with the airline. I've had instances where I've not been notified that the flight's been cancelled. I've had instances where it's been very misleading as to what I actually booked. So generally I steer clear of it unless it's too good an offer to resist, but you have to understand the risk you're taking. But yeah, that's Skyscanner, and that's why I generally don't use it. I would normally always use Google Flights as a starting point, and then when I want some more details, I would go into ITA Matrix. And I'll post all the details of how to use ITA Matrix below. Well, that's all for this week. Join me next week when I'll be talking about the cheapest way to spend money abroad and buying tickets in foreign currency. Until then, happy travels.